Vivian Blackwood raised a champagne flute in the middle of the engineering floor and smiled as Nolan Pierce's badge went dead in front of dozens of people who worked for her. She called him a single father who cost too much for a job any younger engineer could handle, then announced that 3 new hires would cover everything he did for less money. Nolan picked up his chipped coffee mug, put it in a cardboard box, and walked out without raising his voice. 6 weeks later, the platform that carried the company's entire revenue began collapsing one layer at a time. By midnight, nobody in that building understood why. If you enjoy watching arrogance send itself an invoice, subscribe now and stay with Nolan until the very last line. I want to take you back about 2 months before that champagne, because the story does not begin with a failure. It begins with a spreadsheet. Blackwood Atlas Systems was 6 weeks away from announcing the largest contract in its 18-year history, and Vivian wanted to walk into the boardroom with 2 headlines instead of 1. The first headline was growth. The second headline was discipline, the kind of number that makes investors lean forward, the kind that says a younger chief executive can run a leaner operation than the generation that built the place. So she asked her finance team for a line-by-line accounting of every salary above a certain threshold, and somewhere on the 4th page of that document she found a name she had rarely spoken aloud. Nolan Pierce, 42 years old, principal infrastructure engineer, 11 years of service, and a total compensation figure that, in Vivian's mind, translated directly into 3 energetic young engineers with modern certifications and no vacation backlog. In her experience, the people who truly mattered were the people whose absence created noise, and Nolan created no noise at all. He arrived early, worked without drama, and left at 5:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays to pick up his daughter from practice, and she had noticed that pattern the way a hawk notices a limp. What she had not noticed was Atlas Spine. That was the platform underneath everything the company sold, a synchronization and reconciliation engine that swallowed millions of orders, inventory movements, and logistics events every day, and turned them into a single coherent picture for enterprise customers who would sue at the first sign of a discrepancy. Nolan had not written all of it, but he had designed the spine of the spine. He had been there when it ran on 4 servers in a rented cage and a prayer. He knew which decisions were deliberate, which were compromises made during a bad quarter, and which had been left in place because removing them would break something 2 systems over. When Vivian asked Derek Shaw what Nolan actually did to justify the number on page 4, Derek gave an honest answer. He said Nolan was the architect of the core, that he was the person you called at 2 in the morning when data stopped agreeing with itself, and that in 9 years the platform had never lost a customer to a reconciliation failure. Vivian heard something different. She heard a man describing a dependency, and dependencies were exactly what she had promised the board she would eliminate. She thanked Derek, closed her laptop, and began, in small increments, to build a case in public. It started as needling in meetings. When Nolan presented the migration readiness review and recommended keeping the redundancy tier fully funded through the transition, she waited until the room was quiet and asked, with a pleasant tilt of her head, whether he wanted the company to keep every old thing forever, because that was the only way to keep himself here. I watched the temperature of that room drop 11 degrees. 2 directors looked at their notebooks. Jenna Coulter, the senior reliability engineer sitting 3 chairs down, went very still. Nolan did not flush, did not laugh, did not reach for the defensive joke that men reach for when they are humiliated in front of their colleagues. He opened the architecture diagram instead. He explained, in the flat and patient voice of a man who had given this explanation 9 times before, that the redundancy tier was not legacy sediment. He said the shadow reconciliation cluster maintained a parallel accounting of every transaction so that if the primary synchronization path ever drifted, The true state could be rebuilt from evidence, rather than guessed at from wreckage. He said the immutable event logs were the only record that could not be rewritten by a bad deployment. He got about 90 seconds in before she stopped listening, and I could see the exact moment it happened, because her pen stopped moving. Her verdict, delivered to the room rather than to him, was that engineering always finds a reason to spend money. Nolan closed the diagram, wrote 3 lines in his own notes, and said nothing else for the remaining 40 minutes. 2 days later, a calendar invitation arrived in his inbox with no agenda and no description, titled Organizational Efficiency Review, scheduled for Friday morning, with attendees that included the chief executive, the head of people operations, and a lawyer. He looked at that title for maybe 4 seconds. Then he began, quietly, to write everything down. Vivian had a plan by then, and it was a genuinely elegant plan on paper, which is the most dangerous kind. Derek Shaw would be elevated to lead architecture with a modest raise, which cost almost nothing and bought enormous loyalty. 2 mid-level engineers would be hired at market rate for the maintenance work. A specialized contracting firm would be retained on a monthly basis to handle whatever the 2 new hires could not, and the contract could be canceled with 30 days of notice, which made it look flexible instead of expensive. But she wanted more than the savings. She wanted the story because the story was what the investors were actually buying, and the story required a demonstration. So when the Friday meeting happened, she did not run it the way a careful executive runs a separation. She turned it into a lesson. She spoke about the difference between institutions and individuals. Nolan sat with his hands folded and absorbed it, and I will tell you that of everything said to him that year, that sentence was the only one that reached bone, because he had spent 11 years writing documentation precisely so that no such wall would ever exist. He did not argue about the decision itself. Nolan asked for one thing, and he asked for it twice. He wanted 2 weeks of structured technical handoff, 10 business days, overlapping with the team taking over, with 3 specific working sessions scheduled inside that window. He explained why the timing mattered more than the courtesy. The platform was 11 days away from beginning a major migration that would move the entire order pipeline onto a rebuilt data model. And a migration is the one period in a system's life when every safety mechanism matters and every undocumented assumption comes due. Vivian laughed. It was a short, genuine laugh, not cruel so much as certain. She said that if the company needed 2 additional weeks of his time simply to understand a system he had built himself, that was not a case for keeping him. That was a confession about the quality of his architecture. Nolan let that sit for a moment, then did the only thing left available to him. He named the 3 things that could not be removed until the migration was validated end to end, and he named them slowly enough that the person taking minutes could get them all down. The shadow reconciliation cluster, the immutable event logs, the previous generation failover routing table. Vivian pulled up the infrastructure cost breakdown on the wall display, found the shadow cluster, and looked at the quarterly figure attached to it. Several $100,000 every 3 months for hardware, storage, and the engineering time to keep it synchronized. She asked how long it had been since that cluster had actually been used to recover anything. Nolan said 3 years. She smiled at the room with the satisfaction of a prosecutor whose witness has just handed her the case. 3 years, she said, of paying a premium for something that does nothing at all. Nolan answered her without heat. He said a fire extinguisher does nothing either. Right up until the morning the building burns, and nobody prices an extinguisher by how often it gets used. The room went completely silent. Vivian did not hear a technical argument. She heard defiance, delivered in front of witnesses, by a man she had already decided was expendable, and she understood immediately that if she allowed him 2 weeks of visible indispensability, the story she needed for the board would evaporate. So she revised the plan on the spot. No 2 weeks, no overlap. He had until the end of business Friday, which was that same day, and the people operations lead did not look up from her notepad while it was said. Nolan spent his last 7 hours doing the most generous thing a person in his position can do, which is work hard for people who have just told him he does not matter. I watched him do it. He did not slow down. He did not write a bitter goodbye letter to the company distribution list, and he did not quietly delete a single line of anything. He exported the full system topology diagrams, current as of that morning, including the 4 subsystems that had changed during the previous quarter, and had not yet made it into the published version. He wrote out the recovery sequence in ordered steps, marked which steps were reversible and which were not, and attached the verification query for each one. Jenna went to Vivienne's office twice that afternoon. The first time she asked for 2 weeks. The second time she asked for 2 days, and offered to run the sessions herself on her own time so no additional cost would appear anywhere. Vivienne told her to stop behaving as though Nolan were the only person in the building who knew how to operate a computer. What neither of them knew was that the access revocation ticket had already been filed with a timestamp 2 hours earlier than the schedule, because Vivienne wanted the badge deactivation to happen while the engineering floor was still full. So at 3:02, with Nolan mid-sentence inside the handoff document, his laptop lost its connection, not gracefully. The document he was writing at that moment was the appendix explaining how to reconstruct the reconciliation state from the event logs if the cluster were ever lost, which is a detail so precisely ironic that I would not include it if it were not true. He tried to reconnect twice. He looked at the spinning indicator, then closed the lid, and understood that the last 40% of what he had intended to leave behind was now going to live only in his own memory. He unplugged his monitor cable, coiled it, and set it neatly on the desk, because that was who he was. Which brings us to the champagne. Vivienne came down to the engineering floor at 4:40 with 2 bottles and a tray of plastic flutes, ostensibly to celebrate the start of the new fiscal quarter and the contract announcement. She gave a short speech that was very good, technically speaking. She talked about momentum, about a company that had grown up, about the discipline required to build something that outlives any single person's contribution. Then she said the line she would eventually hear read back to her by a lawyer. No individual is larger than the organization. People clapped. Somebody topped off her glass. Nolan came through the floor at that exact moment carrying a box the size of a bread loaf. It held the chipped mug, a framed photograph, a soldering iron he had brought from home years earlier, and nothing belonging to the company. Vivienne saw him and called his name across the room, and 30-some people turned to watch. She told him not to worry, that 3 engineers would be dividing up his responsibilities, and that at long last the company was going to find out how difficult that work truly was. 2 managers laughed, the strangled little laugh of men who need their jobs. A younger engineer near the coffee machine stared at the floor and did not move. Nolan looked at her for perhaps 3 seconds. He was not angry, and this is the part people always find hardest to believe. He had nothing left to protect and nothing left to prove, and what remained was the thing that had always driven him, which was that he did not want the platform to break. So he did not ask for his job, and he did not tell her what she was. He said, make sure they read section 7.4 before they change anything in the recovery layer. Vivienne lifted her glass, took a small sip, and told him they would be fine. Nolan nodded once, stepped into the elevator, and the doors closed on 11 years. On Monday morning, Vivienne signed the decommissioning authorization for the Shadow Reconciliation Cluster. She did it early, before the executive staff meeting, so the additional savings could be added to the quarterly deck as a second data point rather than a footnote. Derek hesitated. He read Nolan's message again, then walked to Vivienne's office and said he would prefer to wait until after the migration validation, maybe 6 weeks, and that the cost of 6 additional weeks was small. Vivienne asked him whether he was the head of architecture or whether Nolan still was. Derek was 31 years old and had wanted that title since he was 24. He executed the change that afternoon, and for 3 weeks nothing whatsoever happened, which is exactly how these things work and exactly why they keep happening. Those 3 weeks were the best of Vivienne's tenure, and I want you to sit inside them for a moment, because the fall means nothing without the height. The board packet was the cleanest document the company had produced in 4 years. The contract announcement landed well, and 2 trade publications wrote flattering profiles that used the word disciplined. Vivienne presented in the September board meeting with a single slide behind her that said the company had eliminated its dependency on one irreplaceable engineer, and Graham Wainwright, the chairman, wrote something in a notebook and did not ask a follow-up question, which she interpreted as approval. She began telling the story at dinners. It became a case study she was proud of, a small parable about sentiment versus arithmetic. Down on the engineering floor, the platform started clearing its throat. The signs were small and individually explainable, which is the definition of a warning nobody heeds. Synchronization batches that had historically completed in 9 minutes began taking 14, then 22. Overnight queues grew by a factor of 3 between 2 and 5 in the morning and drained before anyone arrived. And a specific alert, one of the 6 Nolan had flagged in the margin as firing quietly before it fires loudly, began appearing 4 to 6 times a night. Derek tagged that alert as noise. I do not think he did it dishonestly. He suppressed it on a Thursday. Jenna, who had worked next to Nolan for 5 years, pulled the underlying metric on her own initiative that weekend and found something that made her stomach turn. The divergence between the 2 data sources was not random. It was growing linearly, and the slope had begun on the day the migration's first phase went live. She wrote it up properly, with graphs, and requested that the shadow reconciliation cluster be rebuilt as a precaution before the next onboarding wave. The request went to Derek, who escalated it honestly, and it reached Vivienne on a Tuesday. She read the first paragraph. Rebuilding that cluster meant reversing a decision she had personally signed. In the same quarter, she had personally announced the savings, in front of a board that had just praised her discipline. It meant that the man she had dismissed in front of 30 people had been correct about the specific thing she had mocked him for. She did not phrase her refusal that way, of course. She phrased it as a question about whether reliability engineering had confused prudence with paralysis. And she closed the conversation with the sentence, "Jenna repeated to me twice," because it was the moment she stopped believing anything could be fixed by escalation. Pierce is gone, and I do not want to hear his name every time a server coughs. Meanwhile, the company was preparing to bring Northstar Retail Group onto the platform. Northstar was the announcement, the reason for the champagne, the largest contract in company history, and its transaction volume would nearly double everything Atlas Spine currently handled. Jenna wrote a formal readiness objection, the kind that goes into a record, stating that the platform should not absorb a doubling of volume while an unexplained data divergence was growing and no reconciliation safety net existed. Derek signed it as well, which took more courage than he is usually given credit for. Vivienne read the objection as fear of accountability, told both of them that engineering had developed a habit of manufacturing reasons to miss commercial deadlines, and ordered the launch to proceed on schedule. The launch began at 10 in the evening on a Tuesday in late October, so the volume ramp would land during low traffic hours. For the first half hour it was flawless, genuinely beautiful, the kind of Qtover engineers tell stories about. Vivienne, watching from her office with a glass of wine and the dashboards mirrored on her wall, sent a congratulatory message to the leadership group at 11:04, praising the team's execution, and, in a closing line she would later try very hard to retract, noting how smoothly the platform ran now that it was no longer built around any one person. 37 minutes after the volume gate opened fully, the first dashboard turned red, then the second, then the third. What happened next was worse than a crash because a crash is honest. Atlas Spine did not die. It fell one floor at a time, over 6 hours, while continuing to accept business, and every floor it fell through made the wreckage below harder to read. Orders kept arriving from North Star at 11,000 per minute, and the platform kept acknowledging them, and a growing fraction of those acknowledgments referenced inventory positions that no longer existed anywhere except in the acknowledgement itself. Derek restarted the synchronization service, which is the reflex every engineer has, and the reflex that is wrong maybe 40% of the time. The restart cleared the in-memory state that had been the only remaining record of which side of the divergence the platform currently believed, and the situation got measurably worse within 4 minutes. Another engineer, working with good instincts and bad information, diverted traffic to the secondary cluster to relieve pressure. The secondary cluster immediately began ingesting the inconsistent stream and writing it into its own store, which meant the corruption was no longer contained to one lineage. By 2:15 there were 2 damaged versions of the truth instead of one, and no way to tell which was less damaged. They tried a rollback at 2:40. This was the correct instinct, and it failed for a reason that took them another hour to fully articulate. A rollback does not restore data by itself. It restores code and configuration, and then the platform must rebuild its current state by replaying evidence, and the mechanism designed to hold and cross-check that evidence had been switched off in September to make a savings number look larger. The immutable event logs still existed, which was the only piece of luck anyone had that night, but the logs were raw. Turning them back into a coherent, reconciled state required the reconciliation environment, and the reconciliation environment had been the shadow cluster. Vivian came into the war room at 3 in the morning in a coat over workout clothes, and she came in wrong. She led with authority instead of questions. She said she did not pay 40 engineers to stand in a room telling her they did not know, and she said it to a group of people who had been awake for 20 hours and had each, individually, been overruled about this exact scenario. Nobody answered her. 2 hours later, at 5 in the morning, no person in that room would put a number on recovery. That was when Vivian, running out of levers, asked for the documentation Nolan had left behind. I think she expected to find nothing. I think she expected the absence itself to be useful, a way to redirect the narrative toward a departed engineer who had hoarded his knowledge and left a booby trap behind him. Jenna opened the archive on the main display without a word and navigated to the infrastructure directory. Hundreds of pages appeared, topology diagrams with revision dates, the runbook rewritten for strangers, the recovery sequence with reversibility flags, the alert inventory with its margin notes. It was, by any reasonable standard, the most thoroughly documented subsystem in the company, produced over 11 years by a man who had been publicly accused of converting knowledge into personal leverage, and it filled the entire wall in a room where 40 exhausted people were staring at it. Nobody looked at Vivian. That silence was the first small reversal of the night, and it was quieter and more devastating than any argument could have been. Derek opened section 7.4 and found the line Nolan had said in bold type, alone on its own line, in a document dated 11 weeks earlier. Do not decommission shadow reconciliation until post-migration validation is complete. Underneath it, because Nolan documented everything including the things he expected to be ignored, was a reference to the change management record for any future decommissioning. Somebody pulled that record up on the second display. It showed the date in September, the ticket, the executed action, Derek's name in the implementer field, And in the approver field, in plain text that could not be argued with, the name Vivienne Blackwood. She recovered fast. I will give her that much. She looked at the wall for perhaps 4 seconds and then said, in a level voice, then rebuild it. Jenna told her it was possible in principle. Then she explained the problem, and she explained it patiently, which under the circumstances was close to heroic. Rebuilding the reconciliation environment required knowing the precise state of the reconciliation ledger at the moment of decommissioning, because that state was the anchor point from which everything afterward would be replayed. Without the anchor, they would be reconstructing 61 days of transactions with no way to verify the result, and an unverifiable reconciliation is not a recovery, it is a guess with a customer's inventory attached. Vivienne asked whether the procedure was in the documentation. Jenna said the procedure was there, completely, step by step. Then do it, Vivienne said. And Jenna, who had been carrying this for 6 weeks, finally looked directly at her chief executive and said the thing that ended the argument. She said the procedure had never been executed, that Nolan had scheduled the full recovery drill and the state capture for the 2nd week of his handoff, that it had been the entire reason he asked for 10 business days, and that the drill had never happened because his access had been terminated on a Friday afternoon 2 hours ahead of schedule. Vivienne did not respond. I watched her understand it in real time, and what I saw on her face was not remorse yet. It was arithmetic. She should have stopped there. Almost everyone does not. By 7 in the morning, with the outage entering its 9th hour and Northstar's operations director sending messages every 20 minutes, Vivienne began building a different structure, and she built it upward, toward the executives who had not been in the war room and did not know what was on the wall. Her framing was careful and almost plausible. Atlas Spine, she said, was an over-engineered platform whose complexity was itself the root cause. Nolan Pierce had designed a system only Nolan Pierce could operate. He had created a key person dependency, and then, when the organization moved to reduce it, he had failed to transfer his knowledge in a professional manner. Then she went further, and this is the point at which several people who had been willing to protect her stopped. She asked the general counsel whether there was a basis to examine whether Nolan had deliberately withheld operational information or had structured the architecture to guarantee his own necessity. She asked for his final month activity logs to be reviewed for evidence of intentional omission. She was at 7:40 in the morning, attempting to convert the man who had warned her into the man who had sabotaged her, and she was doing it while his warning sat on the war room wall in bold type 9 floors below. Jenna heard about the legal inquiry from an assistant at 8:15, and something in her simply gave out. She did not go to Vivienne. She had learned that lesson. She went to Elliot Vaughn, the chief financial officer, who had championed the cost reduction program from the beginning, and who had spent the previous 4 hours discovering that the operational impact of the outage was an order of magnitude larger than anything in his models. She sat down across from him and turned her laptop around, and she walked him through the correspondence in chronological order. There were 4 messages from Nolan in his final month, all sent through company systems, all retained. The earliest, from the Readiness Review, stated that removing the redundancy layer before migration validation would create an unrecoverable reconciliation risk. The second requested a minimum of 10 business days for a structured handoff, with the recovery drill and state capture listed as line items. The third, sent to Derek and Jenna at 4:11 on his last afternoon, contained the instruction about the shadow cluster and the pointer to section 7.4. And the fourth was not from Nolan at all. It was Vivienne's reply to the handoff request, 4 words long, time-stamped and unambiguous. Denied. We are not paying for unnecessary overlap. Elliot read all 4 twice. Then he asked Jenna a sequence of questions in the flat voice of a man building a record. Was there any evidence Nolan had retained credentials or withheld access? No. Had he deleted or altered anything in his final week? No. And every action in his final week was logged and had been additive. Had he made any change to the platform in the 90 days before his departure that was not documented and reviewed? No. Was there any indication whatsoever that he had degraded the system before leaving? None. Elliot set his pen down and asked the only question that remained. Then why is it dying? Jenna answered without any particular emphasis, which is why it worked. She said the platform was dying because the company had removed the specific components he had told them, in writing, not to remove, before completing the validation he had told them, in writing, to complete, using a handoff period he had requested and been denied. Then she added one more sentence, and Elliot wrote it down verbatim. She said that the recovery procedure they now desperately needed had never been rehearsed, because the man who wrote it was locked out of the building 2 hours early, so his badge could die in front of an audience. At 9 in the morning, North Star's counsel sent formal notice that the service level breach thresholds had been crossed and that remedy provisions were now active. Elliot ran the exposure himself on a legal pad because he did not trust himself to build a model that fast. Contractual penalties, the reconciliation liability for merchandise promised and not delivered, the 2 other enterprise customers whose contracts contained cross-referencing clauses, and the likelihood that North Star would exit within the cure window. The lowest defensible figure he produced had 8 digits. He looked at that number, and then he looked at the savings figure from September, which had been slightly under $900,000 annualized. And he did the division and got a ratio that he later described as the most expensive fraction of his career. Vivian came to the same conclusion from a different direction at 9:20. She stood at the head of the war room table, and she said 2 words. "Call Pierce," Jenna called it, rang out. She called a second time and left a message that was almost entirely composed of technical facts, because she knew that was the only language that would matter. Vivian told her to call again. She did, at 9:40 and at 9:55, and nothing came back. An engineer sitting near the door, out of some mixture of curiosity and spite, looked Nolan up on a professional network and turned his monitor around so the room could see it. Nolan Pierce had started a new role 19 days earlier. Director of Infrastructure Resilience, Halcyon Dynamics. Halcyon was not an obscure firm. Halcyon was the company Blackwood Atlas had attempted to recruit 2 senior engineers away from the previous spring unsuccessfully, and whose platform reliability record had been used as a benchmark in Vivian's own board materials. His title now contained the exact word describing the exact discipline she had cut. Vivian looked at the screen for a long moment, and the color went out of her face in stages, and she sat down in a chair that was not hers. Graham Wainwright arrived at 5 the following morning, having flown in overnight. He did not ask who was at fault. He asked for a timeline. He said the word twice, and then sat down at the end of the war room table with a legal pad and waited, and the silence while people organized themselves lasted almost a minute. Vivienne presented first, and she presented well, because presenting was genuinely her gift. She described an unforeseen technical failure at the intersection of a complex migration and an unprecedented volume increase. She used the phrase cascading edge case. She noted that the platform's architecture carried historical complexity that the current team had inherited. She was perhaps 4 minutes into it when Graham held up one finger, and she stopped, and he asked his first question. "When did Nolan Pierce warn you about the redundancy layer?" Vivian said that many people had raised many concerns during the transition period. Graham repeated the question with no change in tone. "When did he warn you?" She said she would need to check the record. Elliot Vaughn, who had spent the previous 2 hours preparing for exactly this moment, said that he had the record and put it on the main display without waiting for permission. They read them in order. The readiness review warning about unrecoverable reconciliation risk, dated 11 weeks earlier. The handoff request specifying 10 business days and listing the recovery drill. The final afternoon instruction naming the shadow cluster and section 7.4. And then Vivienne's forward denial. Elliot advanced one more slide, unprompted, and showed the September change record with her name in the approver field. Then he showed Jenna's formal readiness objection from 3 weeks before the launch, with the recommendation to rebuild the cluster, and the disposition field marked declined by the office of the chief executive. Graham read all of it without saying a word. Then he asked how much the savings had been. Elliot said $880,000 annualized, of which roughly $220,000 had actually been realized to date. Graham asked what the current exposure was. Elliot said that if the platform was restored within the next 12 hours, the credible range began around $14 million, and that if the outage extended into a third business day and Northstar exercised its exit rights, the figure moved past $40 million before anyone counted the effect on the funding round. Graham looked at Vivienne for the first time in several minutes. He said, then this was not a saving. He let a pause open up and he did not fill it quickly, and I have thought about that pause many times since. Then he said, this is an invoice. He tapped the legal pad once with his pen and moved on, and Vivienne understood that she had just been removed from something, though the formal part had not happened yet. She tried once more. She said, reasonably enough, that the immediate priority was restoration, and that they needed Pierce for a few hours to walk the team through the reconstruction. Graham corrected her sentence, and he did it gently, which was somehow the cruelest available option. He said, no. You need the man you announced 6 weeks ago could be replaced by 3 cheaper people. And then, because he was a chairman and not a moralist, he stopped there and turned to Jenna and asked her to make contact again, this time on behalf of the board of directors rather than the executive team, with a specific instruction about how the request should be phrased. Nolan answered on the second ring at 6:40 in the morning from his kitchen. Jenna heard a coffee maker and a teenager's voice in the background asking about a permission slip. He did not gloat. He did not say I told you then or ever, and I want that on the record because it is the thing that separates him from every satisfying revenge story you have been told. He listened to 90 seconds of summary and asked exactly one question. He asked whether the immutable event logs were intact. Jenna said they were, all 61 days of them. Nolan was quiet for 4 or 5 seconds. Then he said, all right, then it is recoverable. But he did not agree to appear. Not as a former employee doing a favor. Not as a man summoned back to the building where his badge had been killed for theater. He set conditions, and he set them in a calm sequence that suggested he had thought about them in the abstract, without ever expecting to use them. Full technical authority for the duration of the recovery, meaning his decisions on the platform were final and not subject to executive override. Vivienne Blackwood excluded from the war room entirely for the duration. No engineer disciplined, terminated, or named in any incident narrative as a cause, because every consequential decision had been made above them, and a written correction in his personnel file recording that he had fulfilled his professional obligation to warn, in writing, on documented dates, before his separation. Graham agreed to all 5 before Jenna had finished reading the list, and then asked Elliot to have the agreement drafted within the hour. Vivienne objected to the 3rd and 5th conditions. She said her exclusion from the operational response would be indefensible to the board, and that the personnel file amendment was an admission of liability that legal would never permit. Graham let her finish. Then he said, "Tonight you do not decide that," and he said it in the same sweater-wearing, unhurried voice he had used to ask for the timeline, and the power in that room finished moving from one end of the table to the other without anybody standing up. Nolan arrived at 6:50 in the morning, with the sky going from gray to pale orange behind the parking structure. He was wearing a plain gray shirt and carrying the same worn laptop bag, and he was not triumphant. There was no line delivered in the lobby. He walked to the security desk, and this is the detail I would put in the film if I were making one. His old badge did not work, because it had been disabled in front of an audience 6 weeks earlier and never restored, so the guard had to issue him a visitor pass and clip a plastic sleeve onto his shirt with a number instead of a name. The only person alive who could untangle that platform stood outside the door of a system he had spent 11 years building, waiting for someone to let him in. Vivienne was standing in the war room when he came through it toward the engineering floor. They looked at each other for 2 seconds. He did not speak to her, and it was not a snub, it was a schedule. He walked to the front of the room, set his bag down, and said to the 40 people in it, "Give me the timeline. Not theories. Not what you think caused it. Events, with timestamps, in the order they happened." He wrote them on the whiteboard himself, in his own handwriting, and for the first time in 9 hours the room had something to look at that was not red. It took him 20 minutes to find what everyone had missed, which was that they were repairing the wrong floor. They had spent the night treating the outage as an availability failure, restarting services, shifting traffic, adding capacity. It was not an availability failure, it was a truth failure. The migration had left 2 data sources evolving independently under load, each internally consistent and mutually incompatible, and every well-intentioned restart and traffic shift had bred a third and fourth variant. The shadow reconciliation cluster had been designed 9 years earlier by Nolan for the specific purpose of detecting and adjudicating this exact condition, which is why its absence had turned a manageable divergence into a 2-day disaster. There was no magic button. I want to be precise about this because the fantasy version of this story ends with 1 keystroke and the real version is better. Nolan split the room into 3 groups and gave each of them a single objective. The first group froze the world. No new rights to the affected pipelines, a hold placed on all inbound acknowledgments, a maintenance state announced to every customer within 9 minutes, which was the first honest communication the company had issued all night. The second group began replaying the immutable event logs into an isolated environment, oldest to newest, 61 days of them. The third group rebuilt a minimal reconciliation environment from his documentation, using the procedure in Section 7.4 that had never rehearsed, with Nolan reading over their configuration line by line. Derek came over at 9 in the morning, gray-faced, and apologized. He said he had executed the decommissioning, that he had known better, that he had let his own promotion make him quiet. Nolan listened to the whole apology, which took a while, and then said something that reshaped the room's understanding of the entire situation. He said, "You followed the decision of the person with the authority to make it, and if that is a firing offense, then nobody below the executive floor is safe anywhere." Then he asked Derek to take over the log replay group, because Derek knew the new data model better than he did, and I want you to notice what that accomplished. Nolan did not have to diminish a single engineer to be proved right, which meant that by mid-morning the only isolated person in that building was the one who had spent 6 weeks trying to isolate him. The reconciliation environment came up at 11:20. The first verified match between the replayed ledger and the primary store landed at 12:40, and somebody actually gasped. From there it was grinding, unglamorous work. Reconcile a region, verify it against 3 independent checks, open a narrow traffic gate, watch it for 11 minutes, widen it. Nolan sat on a rolling chair in the middle of it with his laptop on a cardboard box because there were no free desks, and he did not raise his voice once in 14 hours. Northstar's operations director confirmed at 4:50 in the afternoon that order flow was processing normally and that inventory positions matched their own system on all sampled records. The engineering floor came apart. People who had been awake for 34 hours were hugging each other and shouting, and somebody put a hand on Nolan's shoulder, and somebody else started clapping until the whole room was doing it. Nolan did not stand up or make a speech. He sat down, picked up a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold 3 hours earlier, and drank some of it, and looked at the green wall the way a man looks at a river that did not flood. Vivian came over during the noise. She stood a little apart and she said, quietly enough that only 2 people heard it, "You won." Nolan looked up at her, and there was no victory anywhere on his face, because for him this had never been that kind of contest. He said, "I was never trying to beat you." Then he looked back at the dashboards, at 11 panels holding steady where the night before there had been nothing but red, and he added the sentence that Jenna repeated at a conference 2 years later without using anyone's name. He said, "I was only trying to keep this from happening." The board convened at 8 the following morning, and there was no shouting because none was required. The numbers spoke in complete sentences. Vivian Blackwood had received a written warning about an unrecoverable reconciliation risk and had not acted on it. She had denied a requested handoff period in a 4-word reply and terminated access 2 hours ahead of schedule, preventing the recovery drill and state capture. She had personally approved the removal of the safeguard she had been warned to preserve, in order to enlarge a savings figure. She had declined a formal readiness objection 3 weeks before a doubling of transaction volume. And she had attempted, with the evidence displayed on a wall 9 floors beneath her, to have the man who warned her investigated for withholding information. The board placed her on administrative leave that morning and, 11 days later, appointed an interim chief executive while a governance review ran its course. She walked out through the same corridor along the engineering floor, where, 6 weeks earlier, she had stood with a champagne flute and told a room full of people that no individual is larger than the organization. Here is the contrast I keep returning to. When Nolan left that building, she was standing in the center of a crowd she had assembled to watch him go. When she left it, the floor was full and busy, and nobody followed her, and nobody raised a glass, and the platform behind her ran without needing anything from her at all. Graham Wainwright offered Nolan the role of Vice President of Infrastructure the same week. With a compensation package roughly 2.5 times what page 4 of that spreadsheet had said was too expensive. Nolan declined within the hour, and not out of spite, which I think disappointed a few people who wanted a colder ending. He said Halcyon had hired him in September for what he could build, at a moment when nobody there needed rescuing, and that he was not going to trade a place that valued him on an ordinary Tuesday for a place that had discovered his value only in the wreckage of a Wednesday night. He did agree to a defined consulting engagement, 90 days, to finish the recovery architecture and train the team properly. The first thing he did was dismantle the very thing he had been accused of creating. Every subsystem in Atlas Spine now required 2 named owners with demonstrated recovery competence, not 1. Recovery drills became quarterly, scheduled, and blocking, meaning a subsystem that had not completed one could not receive a major change. Documentation became a release requirement rather than a virtue. And he wrote into the engineering charter a formal technical objection process, with the provision he cared most about. When an engineer files a written risk objection and an executive overrides it, both the objection and the override go to the board's audit committee automatically, within 24 hours, with names attached. On his last afternoon, Derek asked him the question the whole team had been circling for 3 months. He asked why Nolan had come back at all and why he was still helping after what had been done to him in front of everyone. Nolan closed his laptop and thought about it for a second because he answered questions rather than deflecting them. He said, "Because the people in this room did not fire me." Then he picked up his bag, and that was the entire answer, and Derek has repeated it to every engineer he has managed since. He walked out through the lobby at 6 in the evening with the light coming in low and gold across the floor. He set the visitor pass down on the security desk, and the guard, who had worked there for 9 years and had signed him in and out 1,100 times, said, "Take care, Mr. Pierce." His phone buzzed as he reached the door. A short message from home asking whether he would be